So, Lynda, thank you so much for taking the time talking with us today about your new book, My Vertical Neighborhood. Um, how are you doing today?
Well, we launched officially yesterday and had a virtual launch party,
All
which
right.
went far better than I thought it was going to go. The idea of a virtual launch party just seemed really anticlimactic, but we had a lot of fun and good conversation. So I'm
That's
feeling pretty excited. Yeah.
that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, how of course it's a new book. It's got to be exciting.
Well, yeah.
Speaking of that, I think that's a great place for us to start.
Mhm.
Is maybe you could tell us a little bit about My Vertical Neighborhood, the book, not your neighborhood, and then what it was that inspired you to write the book.
Certainly, I was thinking about the fact that it didn't actually start out as a book at all, although it started sort of from a book. So, 20 years ago, I heard Michael Frost, the Australian missiologist, speak. He wrote the book Incarnate, among a lot of other books. And he talked about moving into a neighborhood with a group of fellow Christians with the express idea to love their neighbors practically. And that talk, sometimes you just hear somebody give a talk or you read a book and you're like, I want to live like that. But I couldn't figure out how to live like that in the life I was living at that point. I was already really enmeshed in church and just different things. But 10 years ago, I made a big change and I moved from the east coast of Canada to Toronto, which is, Canada's largest city. And when I came, I thought maybe I could try that Michael Frost thing. Like maybe I could actually explore what it would be like not to make friends with the people, go find a church automatically, or, I work for InterVarsity, not with my Christian colleagues. But what if I just tried to make friends with the people who lived around me first? And as I started to think about that, the other thing I started to think about was this commandment to love our neighbors. And I began to ask the question, well, why love? Like, why did God give us that commandment anyway? And what would happen if we actually embraced it? So for the first year, I was living in my high-rise apartment building, which is where the name for the vertical neighborhood comes from. I started to try to meet neighbors. It took a while. It actually took somebody else moving into the building who was very much wired like I was to meet neighbors, to love neighbors. And we just started doing things. And as we started doing things, hosting dinners, inviting people in, getting to know people, life started to unfold in really interesting ways. And I started telling people stories about what was happening in my neighborhood. And then people started saying, you should write a book about that. You should write a book about that. And eventually I thought, well, I have a writing background. I'd never written a book on my own before totally. So I thought, you know what, maybe I should write a book about that. That was 7 years ago. I started the process of writing the book. So it took a long time, all the while living into life in a vertical neighborhood, life with neighbors. It continues on, but that's a little bit of how the book came to be.
Oh, that's awesome. You know, even in I guess, a house neighborhood where you just have to deal with a few families, didn't used to be that hard, but I guess over the last couple of, decades, it's gotten worse and worse on being able to communicate and just be relational with each other. I can't even imagine in a vertical neighborhood, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with people that live in vertical neighborhoods, but since they are so closely put together, they seem to be a little more reserved. So maybe you could tell me, what was one of the hardest hurdles for you to overcome to turn it into a neighborhood?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. And I think one of them is exactly the principle that you talk about in any neighborhood in the current age that we're in. People are less likely to engage with strangers. They're less likely to even see their neighbors because they, even in a suburban neighborhood, you might drive into your garage and only hang out in your backyard. So do you even see the people who live around you? Interestingly, I found when I moved into a high rise, you could walk the hall any time, like over and over and over, and not run into your neighbors. You just don't see them. Or if you do see them, there's this protocol, where you're living so close that you're actually very careful about being polite. So you, in an elevator might say, hello, how are you? But you would never ask anybody their name. But those things weren't the hardest thing to to overcome. I think the hardest thing to overcome, both for me and my friend Rachel, who is was really my core partner in the story of actually meeting our neighbors, it was that we had a desire to be consistent with this, to show up every week, to be available to people. But that came out of our Christian belief and our desire to live out our faith. But if people don't have that desire, then transience is the thing. We choose in, we choose out, we come sometimes, we don't get, people come and go. So having a consistent sense that you could actually be in people's lives long enough to really get to know each other was hard. We started throwing these Monday night dinners, and the first, week we had 1 or 2 people come, and then after that, nobody came for 3 weeks. And we would look at each other and kind of go, do we just keep doing this or what? But eventually a core group started to come. But it took time.
I can't imagine how the difficulties that must have, because, I mean, obviously if you're in a high rise, then you're in a more densely populated area, and people that migrate to densely populated areas enjoy it because they are anonymous, whether they're in a crowd at a sports event or at the condo or wherever they are. It's alone time, right?
Right.
That's something.
Yeah, I mean, all deep down, I think what I discovered is most people don't really want to be anonymous. Like if they can find a trusted community, a trusted group of people, they want somewhere to belong. They want to make friends. But
right. I mean, God makes you that way, really.
Yeah,
You said you're relational.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Since then you were able to break that barrier, and let's go way into the positives now. Maybe you could share a story of something that happened during that time that was particularly heartfelt or inspiring, or you just really felt some true meaning from it.
I think the most surprising thing that we did that made the most difference to me personally, and I think to other people, was we decided to start a writers group. We talked about starting a book club because that's kind of, people would know what that was. Sure, we'll get together, read a book. We were already doing these dinners, but we started a writers group and invited, just put up signs. If you want to write, if you want to learn about writing, come join this group. And we met in the public dining room of the condo building. And from the very first week that a couple of people came, and then week after week, we met about once a month for about 7 years. But week after week, in the very first year, people started to lay out their stories of their lives in these really personal, like they started to share incredibly personal things. We would choose a word like neighborhood, write about the neighborhood you grew up in. And people would come with a short story or a few paragraphs. And the very first night, I remember saying to my friend Rachel, this feels like really sacred ground we're on. Like, I don't know what's happening in this room, but there's an honesty and a vulnerability people are responding to and feeling. Later on, we hosted a Saturday morning Bible study, but I never got the same sense of sacred space that I got, in the book I call the chapter Unfurling Our Stories. And I feel like that's what we were doing for each other. One friend who came, she called it her therapy group. Week after week, or month after month, we'd hear more, we'd learn more about each other. So for me, that opportunity for people to go away, maybe it was because they went away and they reflected on what they wanted to write, and then came in and bravely shared it, and people received it and asked questions, and people began, it shakes off that anonymity thing again. People began to feel like, oh, it's safe. So I continue to think about those writers group evenings as times where we had this sense of sacred space, where people opened up their lives to one another.
I heard a talk once where someone was discussing, I think it was a study in England where, and this had to do more with like technology, but it's in the same vein, that when people are in, open areas and or a party or anywhere where they don't know each other and they get together, they start talking small talk. Mm-hmm. And then within 7 minutes, the small talk's over. It doesn't matter what size the group is. Mm-hmm. And then someone has to take a leap of faith and trust people that they're not going to, because they have to say something personal. Right. And of course, in this talk, they found that most people would reach for their phone at 7 minutes and start. Uh-huh. So you have a group of people not talking. But that's kind of what you're saying with that sacred space is, once they actually share something personal, that's a whole new ballgame.
Oh, yes. And the other thing that happened, even in our Monday night dinners, is some of the people who came early on had personalities where they actually wouldn't look at their phone in 7 minutes, but they would share something personal, or they'd ask a provocative question. And it made for very lively dinners. There was nothing off the table. We talked about everything and anything under the sun, which made some people uncomfortable, and they left, or they came every now and then. But as we continued to do that, there was a lot of life and authenticity and interest and engagement. I tend to be a person who grew up in a sort of filtered kind of, culture where you were very careful what you said. And I think for me, I became much more courageous and brave myself to say, why don't I just say what I think? What's going to happen if
It's a lot more fun.
It's a lot more interesting.
Well, it's interesting that you said, you started writing the book like 7 years ago. So it was already difficult for people to be relational between, I guess, just some people blame postmodernity, some people blame digital age, whatever the case may be. But now, with the age of COVID, people have totally lost, the ability to be able to engage, because even when you do engage with someone, it's a Zoom call. I mean, we're getting a little better, but I guess at this point, I'm worried, maybe not worried, concerned that people may have a hard time re-engaging with their fellow man as we do start to come out again. It's like we're, cavemen coming out of the cave and going, who are you? What advice would you have for helping people to rebuild that relationship in their neighborhood?
Yeah, I think it starts with an intentionality. And for myself, and I think for others of us who would call ourselves followers of Jesus or Christians, we have a commandment that says, love your neighbor. So the question is, well, how am I going to do that? As I even come out of the age of COVID, am I going to actually stop on the sidewalk and talk with my neighbor outside instead of just passing them by? Or once we believe it's safe to invite somebody new into our house, will we do that? Will we find ways to do it? I actually believe it's incumbent on Christians or anybody else who has a belief that loving our neighbor is going to be better for the world, that we find intentional ways to do it. Figure out how to get through the fears. So praying about those kinds of things, I think, is really important. If we don't act with intentionality and figure it out, I kind of fear for our world. But I believe we've been given some clear direction and advice on how to do it. I think it's absolutely fine for people to start small. It's like one step. Sometimes, I when I walk right now out in nature, or when I'm walking around my neighborhood with my mask on, I'll kind of quietly, intentionally pass the peace like you do in church on a Sunday morning. So I'll walk by a person and I'll say hello and smile, or maybe I'll see somebody who looks grief-stricken and I'll say a prayer for them. Like, just noticing people. Maybe that's the first step for us, is notice who's in front of you and do that thing of passing peace, however you might do it. But I don't think we have to feel like we have to throw huge parties to begin with. I think it's intentionally greeting people, intentionally asking, how are you doing? What was hard for you? And maybe, the 7-minute small talk thing, a little more quickly asking people, what was the hardest thing for you in COVID? And see what opens up.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we're God's hands and feet. We just have to push past that uncomfortable zone, and God's going to bless our intentions.
I think so. So. He certainly did for me. I ended up with amazing friends and a whole lot of experiences that were fantastic.
Yeah, you start off just trying to see how you can turn it into a neighborhood. Then you have all these friends. I couldn't be any better than that. Well, we're almost out of time. Would you like to have any final thoughts you'd like to share with the audience?
Yeah, let me just jump off the comment. We've both been talking about making friends and having friends. Early on, as I started to talk about people, I often ask people, well, why don't you love your neighbor? Or why don't you do more to love your neighbors? And a lot of people will say, well, I just don't have time. Like, I have friends and family and work and church, and I have too much in my life. And one of the things I realized as I was writing the book and really grappling with this and thinking about it is I think our neighbors are people who are going to be transient in our lives. It's not like these relationships have to be forever. The whole idea of a neighbor is that person who's right in front of you right now. And some of them will become friends. But I don't think we have to be so fearful that I won't have room for more people in my life, which is what I've often heard from people. I just don't know how I would sustain that. You don't actually have to sustain it necessarily. Just pay attention to who's in front of you right now and what God is asking of you right now. And some people will become lifelong friends and some people will move on. But what you'll have done with each other in the moment that you've encountered each other will make a difference. And, you know, in our age where racial violence and bystanders not doing anything and fear is so prevalent, I believe it is God's call on those of us who follow the commandment to be intentional. Do
I
something.
love it. It's, you know, basically just see people. If it's a long-time friendship that develops, that's awesome. If it's that one-time interaction, you still touch that person. That's wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, you know, once again, My Vertical Neighborhood, everybody needs to rush out right now and pick up a copy. IVP Press.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be with you today.
Thanks.